superheroes. You know them, you love them, you've grown up with them. And when you were a child, you wanted to be one. But what if you lived in a world where the heroes themselves were completely wiped out, with only the minor heroes left to pick up the pieces? What if all the major heroes were gone, leaving the world as a playground for villains? What if there was a world where there were no more heroes? And that shall be the discussion of today's review. Greetings, fellow readers. This is Rambling Collector, and I'm here to bring to light the superhero, or should I say, supervillain anthology known as No More Heroes, edited by Wayne Goodchild and Bill Tucker. I actually found this book when I was going through another convention, and it really stuck out to me, because as I've mentioned in my review of Victor Boone Will Save Us by David Joel Stevenson, there is little to no superhero literature that is not a comic book, just a fully fledged novel. But this one, an independent work, is a collection of short stories that tells the tale of a world that has been left broken and on the verge of collapse after a massive climactic battle has left the world without its major heroes and villains, but in the process has left all the minor villains to rise up in the massive power vacuum that has been left behind, and thus the world has become a playground for these villains to wreak havoc and chaos across the globe. And as the story progresses, it just gets worse and worse, because there are barely any heroes left to fight them. Only minor heroes are left, and they are stretched thin trying to stop this. But in the end, the world is doomed, as it becomes a villain's playground. Hence the title, No More Heroes. Now, I could sit here and talk about all the different stories that occurred here, but I will limit it to just 4 main short stories here that really stood out to me. And I will say this, despite the grim reality of this story, there are a few bright spots that do occur throughout this collection, but not many. All in all, though, I will say this story of No More Heroes was absolutely fantastic, and I loved it, because it really presents the idea, like, what if the Justice League or the Avengers were completely wiped out, and the world became the villains' playground? Now, we did get that answer in one Marvel comic, Old Man Logan, which I have reviewed in the past, and I will leave a link to here. But, more than that, with DC, I'm not sure if there has been a comic that deals with something like this. But, I think I've talked long enough. Let's get started with the first short story, Light in the Darkness. Now, Light in the Darkness by Mark M. Johnson was the first short story in this collection that really stuck out to me, mostly due to the scale that it was presenting, that there was more than just the heroes and villains fighting each other that really caused the downfall, but that there are greater evils out there in the galaxy, as proposed by our main character here, Nathaniel, the last of a species known as Iorians, that have been running and hiding from a cosmic evil known simply as the Darkness, but has rapidly become known as the supervillain Black Empty. And the ironic thing is, when the Darkness first started out, it was like a massive planet-eating, destructive force. But after encountering the Iorians, it has been shrunken down to a shard of what it once was, a mere fragment that has taken a human shape, and yet it still poses a very immense danger to everyone and everything it meets, due to the fact that it doesn't just kill you, it torments you for thousands of years, trapping you in the worst possible scenarios in your mind, feeding you nothing but pain and torment, only to repeat the cycle soon after. Now Nathaniel is trying to find a way to at least seek out Black Empty to serve as a distraction for his wife and children, so that they can go and join the rest of the Iorians in hiding for the Gathering, as it is called. And Nathaniel's journey cross-country is really fascinating with the way that he inspires hope for others, whilst hoping to buy time for his family and even his species, sacrificing himself to Black Empty to buy time to give hope for their species, and really highlighting the downfall of a civilization as advanced as theirs was. And the Iorians are shown to be extremely powerful, with curing ailments, telepathy, mind games, and even casting mind-boggling realistic illusions to share their memories with others. So Iorians are extremely powerful, but are now on the verge of extinction due to this cosmic horror known as Black Empty. And then, at one point, when we finally get to the confrontation, it's in Washington, D.C., which, due to the cataclysm caused by the utter extermination of the superheroes and supervillains, that caused a red and black mushroom cloud to appear over Australia into Earth's orbit, no less. That has left Australia, the entire continent, in a blasted wasteland. DC itself has become a massive fortress, letting nobody in or out, which is completely understandable considering the state of the world right now. But Nathaniel managing to sneak his way in there to confront Black Empty. The story of that sacrifice, sharing his species' story, as well as sharing as to why he has set himself up like this, to give his family a chance to escape, to hide, to give hope for his species that they can still survive, only to realize just the sheer, the sheer depth of the agony he's about to experience. And that was only what lasted for a few seconds. He will be left to suffer nothing but immense torture for thousands of years, also that he can give his family time to escape. That is heroic if I have ever seen anything like that before. But speaking of villains, let's move on to the next story. Next we have Picking Up the Pieces by Carrie Burns. Now this one is actually a supervillain focused short story. Unlike the previous one, which was a bit more heroic, this one focuses on the kind of day-to-day of a supervillain, known as Karen Dawes. Now, we never really hear her supervillain identity, but we gather the fact that she is a major player within this new league of supervillains that she has found herself in. All of the minor villains that are now filling in the power vacuum left behind after the deaths of so many other higher class villains. Now, as for Karen though, her powers are pretty interesting actually. She has the unique ability of a regeneration factor, the ability to regenerate lost limbs or even organs. All of this was done by a ritual that she had done when she was younger, and as such, it allowed her to become a supervillain. And simply because any damage that she takes, she could regenerate it, like a lizard, which would probably play into her supervillain name, which, again, we never hear. However, the story of this, Picking Up the Pieces, has Karen going into the doctors for a checkup, only to find out that she has a cancerous growth, specifically ovarian cancer, which, unfortunately, due to her powers, would constantly be regenerating. And watching Karen go through the stages of grief here, the sheer denial, thinking that she can be able to get through this, power on through, but knowing for a fact that it's a hopeless struggle, because regardless of what she does, she doesn't really have that many options. She can keep getting surgery after surgery to remove the cancer, but in the end, it'll just keep growing back, along with the organs that she lost. And watching her going through this grief really highlights the humanity of some of these characters. And you see that a lot in superhero comics as well. Some villains are not all about power or money, all that stuff, or even just trying to prove their point or whatever. Some of them are just regular average people, and some of them die not from some final climactic battle with their arch enemy or in some massive suicide attack or whatever. Some of them just die of natural causes, like Karen. And watching her going on to accept that, despite her boss, Dr. Pustule, constantly trying to contact her for another job, only for her to finally reveal to him that she is dying. And even when he presents the option of her canceling out the ritual, she chooses not to, and to just accept her death with pride. And here's the ironic bit. At the end of it, all she asks for is for a recipe from another villain known as Cookie Crumbler, a guy who can make sweets and use them as an attack. Yeah, there are some ridiculous villains in this collection, in this story, but hear me out. They are really good characters all around. Like I said, minor villains are picking up here. But Karen really was a fascinating human approach to supervillains, making them all not out as just evil for the sake of being evil, but some of them just being human, learning to live their life or just getting their affairs in order, like she has done. And honestly, that's incredibly wholesome, and it really sets the mood for just sometimes all you can do is just accept your life and just make the best of it while you still can. But let's move on to another one. Now, let's talk about something a little bit more inspiring. Here we have The Sidekicks by Scott Voss. And I gotta be honest with you guys, this one is definitely a bit more uplifting and a bit more, let's say, a little less grim, a little less somber. But needless to say, there is still some very messed up imagery here. But anyways, The Sidekicks follows the tale of Jeff, a simple police officer who at one point was saved by the villain Black Empty. Yes, he's a recurring villain in this collection. He was saved by a superhero at one point, acting as a sort of temporary sidekick. But because of this, he was actually inspired to group up with his fellow police officers, especially after the Cataclysm, and state that even though they could not be full-fledged heroes, they could still fight the good fight in some way. Hence they call themselves the Sidekicks, choosing to help out any minor heroes that are still left after the Cataclysm, and going out to help others as well, including EMTs and firefighters. But as for Jeff, he is not having the best of times right now, considering that he is currently a captive and unwilling sidekick to Black Empty. Now, Black Empty is simply using Jeff as a sort of battery to just feed off of. Kind of like the Dementors of Azkaban with their prisoners. But, anyways, Black Empty is feeding Jeff constant illusions of despair, including one of watching his son, Trevor, get run over by a truck and his wife to blame him for it. And Jeff has to endure all of this because of the fact that his wife and son are currently being held captive by Black Empty. And I really like the test of Jeff's will here, because he's being tormented, possibly for days, weeks, maybe even months, who knows. But despite all of this, he never gives in, even when he's on the point of just absolute despair, being tortured by this cosmic being, this cosmic villain, I should say. He never gives up. And it's actually really inspiring to see this, because you see these regular average people going above and beyond to do what's right, stepping up and trying to help out, being heroes in their own right. Even if they're not on top tier heroes, they are still acting as heroes in their own right. And that is absolutely inspiring for anyone to listen to or read, for instance. Like I said, there are a few good inspiring short stories in here, and Sidekicks, as well as Light in the Darkness, were definitely some of the most inspiring. And I personally really liked this one. It shows the indomitable will of man or woman, and just choosing to fight the good fight despite how outclassed you might be, as well as seeing that in the end he still has that spark of hope within him, especially from that hero that he had saved so long ago. But let's move on to, in my opinion, one of the best stories in this collection. And finally, for this review, we have The Nightwatch with Winston Owens by Chad Williamson. This story for me really stuck out with its unique premise of different points of view all connecting in one major story, meanwhile being supplemented with what looks like radio talks of a radio show known as The Nightwatch, which covers heroes and villains. Throughout all of this, we see these different characters all coalescing in this one story, while a talk show host, Winston Owens, is debating about the rising heroes and villains debacle that's going on, and the world is being plunged into further chaos because of it. Now, the whole story starts off with a simple cop running around trying to solve the cases that are occurring while heroes are going off, doing their own thing, causing all kinds of wanton destruction when they're trying to fight these supervillains. Meanwhile, his daughter, who had run off to Vegas, who actually appears further in this story. He has not contacted her once, doesn't know anything about what she's been up to. All he feels, though, is this great disappointment. But then, when he's out at the cafe grabbing a bite to eat, after a quick spat with the radio host, we cut to another point of view of the daughter of a rich CEO who is filled with such anger, jealousy, and just straight up spite, but also longing to hook up with a northern superhero in Canada. But what does she do? She lets her jealousy drive her to break into her own former house, kill her father and her new stepmother, just so she can grab all the money and run off to Canada. And her main reason for this was because of love, trying to go and find this new superhero, saying, he'll love me, he has to. That is the kind of obsessive behavior you don't want to get caught up in, that you need to be careful about. But then we actually see the perspective of the stepmother, whom the daughter hated with a passion and viewed as a gold digger, just digging her claws into her father and taking all the money for herself, leaving the daughter high and dry. But then we learn the daughter is not so much of an angel as she would think herself to be. And in fact, when we get the showgirl in her final moments before passing on to death, as she is in mental contact with someone with a superpower to see the future or to communicate with dead people, we learn that she had had a miserable time running off and had been, at one point, a dancer, but then she was forced to become a showgirl. But after a while, we see that she'd been heading down a dark path, only to be picked up by this CEO known as Monty, whom she originally thought had hired her just for a quick ignite and nothing more. But in the end, he showed her compassion and care. He cared about her, he talked to her, did not use her as an object. But what they tried to do was teach the daughter, whom, from what we understand from the father, was more or less a leech more than anything else. We come to find out that they were trying to teach her responsibility and as well as a little bit of humility, but seeing the end results, it looks like it has backfired severely. Not to mention our police officer, whom this showgirl was actually the daughter of, the missing daughter that we learned of from the cop. This cop has actually been investigating a string of murders going on, involving what looks like anthropologists meeting up, but in reality is a gang of pedophiles who would dress up as clowns to meet kids, and they're all being murdered. And while they have to investigate this because it is a murder, they do not feel sorry for these people. In fact, they want to just close this case, because it disgusts them to no end. They're having to investigate the murders of pedophiles targeting children. And it just goes to show how messed up this world is. Meanwhile, as the talk show is still going on throughout the story, we learn that the world is just spiraling further and further into chaos. And it's not looking like it's going to be a happy ending for this world whatsoever. This does not back away from the reality of the situation that after the cataclysm, the world has gone into the villain's playground and it's only getting worse, as evidenced here. And I like that this does not shy away from it. Chad Williamson's writing was absolutely fantastic. All of these authors that I've mentioned before were absolutely fantastic. Hell, there are so many that I wish I could go over, but for time, I will not. I will simply share my thoughts on a few of the stories and leave them for you all to decide. With all that being said, let's move on to the final score. With all that being said, I'm going to have to give No More Heroes a solid 10 out of 10. I loved it, it was amazing, and it really gives a good perspective of a world post the massive climactic battle of heroes and villains which resulted in so many deaths. And seeing this world become a villain's playground, the interesting premise, not to mention the different stories being told by different authors. It is an absolute treat for anyone who is interested in checking out a bit of superhero, or supervillain in this case, literature, who wants a break from the comic books and wants to read a good book, told with many different perspectives and tales, with losses and tragedy, and all around just watching the world fall into chaos in a way. I will not spoil it, but the epilogue really caught me off guard, but I also kind of expected it. But the prologue was also really done well, too. There's a lot more I could go into with details here. And if you would like me to cover more of the short stories from this collection, feel free to let me know. But if you're interested to see more of the other books that I've covered, you can click the playlist right here. Or if you're interested in checking out some of the more independent authors, here's a link to that playlist as well. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this review, and once again, thank you for listening to this crazy man's ramblings. I hope I was able to invigorate you to check out this story. It is amazing and worth the read. You will not be disappointed at all, whatsoever. Anyways, you guys, thank you so much for listening. This is Rambling Collector signing off for now. And keep reading, my friends. Have an awesome day.